This statement can be true for any said person, for we as people will never be able to attain all knowledge possible. But this statement also has a second truth. The truth of being open-minded and accepting of new ideas and points of view so that we may see the world in all its angles. This is something that will lead the generation of today and the innovators of tomorrow. My fellow peers, we are the generation of today and we are the innovators of tomorrow. And if we are to truly change this world, we must not only work, but learn from each other. With that, I would like to begin what horticulture is and what divisions of employment does it give us, or give me at least. Horticulture is the act, science, or the practice of garden cultivation and management, essentially. And the big three divisions in which they have simply is landscape design, nursery management, as well as private research. At first, I'll let you into the landscape design aspect. Landscape design is basically the creative side of horticulture. It's how horticulturalists express themselves in a way in which we can incorporate plants, so that we can craft beauty out of essential plants that we find in a certain environment or ecosystem. The second big employment division that there is nursery propagation and cultivation. Basically, nursery propagation and cultivation is they get plants, they sell plants, it is the plant cycle. It's just how you get plants to your garden and how you are able to get them already pre-grown. The last division will be private research. Private research is by far the hardest to get into, simply because of the competitiveness between horticulturalists to enter this field, as well as with the investment costs that come in with research firms wanting you to discover something that you may not or may discover. Furthermore, to go into the big idea of what horticulture is, there's 5 giant subdivisions in which I will be talking to you about. First, we're going to start with arboriculture. It's basically vegetables. How do you grow vegetables? You give them water, you give them light, you give them the essentials, and a vegetable appears. Now, I am kind of simplifying it, but there's a lot more that goes into vegetable propagation and vegetable cultivation. But essentially, arboriculture shows how to store, how to market, and how to produce this on a large scale. The second subdivision is going to be pomology. Pomology is simply fruit. How to grow fruit, what fruit trees are, everything in the fruit aspect in the fruit world. Fruit, from the law of the land, the law of the horticulturalist, is basically you eat it while it's raw. If you can eat it while it's raw, it's pretty much fruit. The third subdivision is going to be floriculture, my personal favorite of all of them. It's because of the ornamental factor in which they have. Ornamentals, or basically ornamental horticulture, if you want to use another term to explain floriculture, is just the growth of beautiful flowers and to show them to the world. This is actually the rising occurrence in cities is floriculture because most people in the city are away from rural areas. Floriculture is a rising occurrence basically just because people like to see pretty things. And well, in a city, if there's not a lot of land or a lot of agriculture or at all, just rural land, then flowers are what is needed. And so that's what floriculture comes into the big city. Now the other 2 subdivisions kind of overlap with the other 3. That's why I decided to present them last. The first is going to be nursery/plant propagation. See, propagation and cultivation are different because propagation is the raising of the plant and cultivation is basically the harvesting of it. Propagation is entirely different from cultivating in the fact that you have to raise the seed, you have to raise it from a seed. The seed aspect within propagation is basically what brings people into there. They like to see it bloom and they like to see all their hard work form into the fruits of their labor, literally. The last thing I would like to talk about for the big subdivision is going to be landscape horticulture. As I said earlier, landscape design is basically the same thing as landscape horticulture, but they just call it the job name. Landscape horticulture is how people make things pretty. The Dallas Arboretum is essentially what landscape is the art of landscape horticulturalist. Landscape horticulturalists basically put the plants where they need to be and decides which plants are needed to be in this area and in this environment/ecosystem. Furthermore, I would like to talk about the interesting things I found in some of my research assessments. In this research assessment, we talked about the three banditos. I know I butchered how to say that in Spanish, but they're called the three bandits essentially, and they're the weeds that everybody finds as malicious enemies to the garden. The first one is going to be Canadian thistle / creeping thistle, either one in which you want to call. But essentially, these are found all throughout Texas, if you haven't seen them. They are the purple spiky flowers that are growing just abundantly everywhere. That is Canadian thistle, and it is an extremely invasive species. It has the ability to create dense mats of roots and to propagate itself within its root system, something that gives it an adaptation over most plants within this ecosystem. The next aspect I would like to talk about is the leafy spurge. The leafy spurge, although is found more in the north areas and in New England and whatnot, it is a common pest for ranchers and ranch hands alike, on the basis of that leafy spurge, if eaten by cattle, is extremely toxic to their systems, and it causes them to have inflammation within their mouths. Something that is quite interesting to see from such a tiny plant. The third one, which I personally enjoy the most, is called the field bindweed / morning glory. Personally, I have had experience with the morning glory because I grow them on my own, and I grow them in my patio. I did not know until my ISM journey that the morning glory is actually a weed, and that is the reason why it grows so fast. And with that weed aspect, it has literally taken over my patio. Now that I know that it is a bandito, I will take heed to make sure that it doesn't spread, nor does it take over the environment in which it's next to, hopefully. The second research assessment I would like to show you guys would be the rose propagation research assessment, where it talks about seedling growth, cloning, as well as pruning. Seedling growth is pretty self-explanatory. You plant a seed in the ground and you give it water. That's how it pops up. If you want to go a little bit into the intricacies of a seed growth, you would have to go more into germination, which is where you put a seed within a wet, moist cloth, you let it sit for 72 hours, and then it sprouts a little sprout. And then you plant it in the ground, voila, you got your plant. Cloning, however, is a much different story, but it does have some benefits. Cloning itself is basically chopping a piece of the mother plant that's in vegetative state and just planting it in the ground. And it itself becomes a plant. And it's interesting to see that you can make an organism from another organism. Not in the fact that it's getting pollinized or it's getting fertilized and then planted in the ground again, but rather it is just appearing again. This is brought on by some cloning solution, which usually has some hormones induced within it. The last thing that I found interesting within my pruning, or within the rose propagation research assessment, was pruning. Pruning is simply just cutting off the dead flowers and the dead foliage in order to raise more flowering and to promote it to flower more. This is pretty useful with vegetables and fruits, just on the basis of that it creates more of what you need. So lastly, what I would like to talk to you guys about today was my interview assessments. So I had 2 interviews so far that really stuck out to me, and one was with this man named Jeff McCauley, who is the landscape designer and the owner of the Shades of Green Inc. down by Coit. It's literally next to Centennial. He discussed with me the intricacies in which and the problems in which you have with horticulture and with landscape design. And I can say there's one principal problem I will find within horticulture, and that is people. Just because people are people, and you can't help when somebody's mad. And for some reason, people are extremely picky about the plants in which they grow in their yards. Don't know why, that's just how it is. He also talked to me about the old school style in which he creates landscape designs in which he draws them by hand, instead of creating them on the internet. Because in the rising currents of our technological world, it seems that landscape design can be produced much more easily on a computer rather than by hand. But at the same time, it takes away more of the creative aspect and the feeling of art that you've made aspect from the landscape design itself. The second interview I had that stuck out to me the most was with Mr. Jim Ewaldson, the president of the Collin County Master Gardener Association. He basically told me that the worst problem he's experienced was the age of people. People are extremely old in my field, and the problem is that they're withering out, and they're tarnishing, and they're losing their minds. I'm sorry to say this, but I have to be the rising occurrence, essentially. And this small portion of my generation which comes into to the field of agriculture is kind of weird, to him especially, because he never sees people like this. He's also an expert on Firewise landscaping, which is basically landscaping to prevent wildfires. Since he lived in Australia for about 10 years, and in the area he lived by, had an extremely abundant rate of wildfires occurring. Besides that, Jim Ebelson also highlighted the fact that when you want to work with horticulture, you have to be able to work with your hands, and you have to love the feeling of hard labor. And I can say that is why I work for horticulture, and why I believe horticulture is the field of study that I want. Principally because I love working with my hands. I love the feeling of putting in hard labor, time, sweat, and blood just to prove that the fruits of my labor came. And in all reality, if you don't work for what you love for, then you shouldn't live at all. Thank you.
Nice.